Zondervan presents 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott, read by the author. The power of thinking twice. Let the first impulse pass, wait for the second. Balthazar Gracian.
3 seconds separate those who give it their all from those who don't give it a thought. Literally. 3 seconds. This brief buffer is all that stands between those who settle for whatever and those who settle for nothing less than whatever it takes. How can such a short span of time make such a big difference? It comes down to 6 predictable impulses that most of us automatically accept without a second thought. Quite literally, we don't consider alternatives to these impulses because they become unconscious habits embedded into our brain. The routine acceptance of any one of these 6 common impulses involuntarily eliminates the possibility of greatness from our lives. Without knowing it, we hem ourselves into a life of diminished returns, all because we don't give the first impulse a second thought. If, on the other hand, we were to give any one of these 6 common impulses a momentary pause, just 3 seconds of deliberation, we would soon see that another impulse emerges. And it is this second impulse that puts us on a higher road. It is this second impulse that reveals our freedom to excel, to move from whatever to whatever it takes. People who are willing to do whatever it takes build better teams, win more respect, and achieve bigger results because of this quality. Their mindset defines everything they do and every encounter they have. Are they merely lucky in life? Are they blessed with a way of thinking that spells success without effort? Not on your life. This alluring and invisible quality is not inherited as much as it is honed. It's a captivating spirit that can be taught and caught. For too long, it has been bridled by the false impression that you either have it or you don't. This book is about to change that. The first instinct fallacy. Renowned psychologist Rollo May said, "Human freedom involves our capacity to pause, to choose the one response toward which we will throw our weight." This freedom to choose the one response, the one that can take your life to a new level, is what I intend to help you experience. As a psychologist and a college professor, I'm familiar with the advice to go with the first impulse. If you've ever taken a multiple choice exam like the SAT, you've probably been told not to change your first choice, even if on second thought you think an alternative answer is probably correct. The common wisdom here is that your initial instincts are the best. But research actually shows this isn't a good strategy. In fact, 33 studies over 70 years suggest that sticking with your first instinct is not a smart approach. Researchers found that when test takers second guess and change their answers, it's most often from incorrect to correct, improving their test scores. Researchers at the University of Illinois call it the first instinct fallacy, and it continues to live on in spite of an abundance of contradictory evidence. Now, let me make this clear up front. I'm not saying that your first impulse is always negligible. Not at all. In fact, one need look no further than Malcolm Gladwell's best-selling Blink to see the undisputed fact that our first instincts are often brilliant. But what I am saying is that when it comes to the 6 specific impulses I'm about to outline, the evidence is abundantly clear that they will not serve you well. In fact, these impulses are downright detrimental. And yet, like panic test takers, we seem to buy into the old saw that says we should go with our first impulse. The 6 impulses that never pay off. You hardly need a scientific study to show you that these 6 instincts are harmful. On the face of it, instinctively, that they are not worthy of your aspiration. But for reasons that we will unpack in the chapters ahead, the vast majority of us continue to give in to these 6 instincts time and time again. Here they are. Number 1, the impulse to give up before trying, because we feel helpless. Number 2, the impulse to shun a challenge, because it seems daunting. Number 3, the impulse to settle for the status quo, because we lack vision. Number 4, the impulse to shirk responsibility, because it's easier to shift blame. Number 5, the impulse to do the mere minimum, because that's all that's expected. Number 6, the impulse to avoid taking action because we fear failure. Each of these impulses is self-sabotaging. They do nothing to elevate our lives. They are, in a sense, a way of smugly saying whatever to life. And yet, day after day, we give in to them over and over again in spite of the deleterious results. Are there more ineffectual impulses than just these 6? Of course. But these half-dozen provide more than enough to chew on. Let me explain. Number 1, the impulse to give up before trying. When faced with a problem that's seemingly beyond your control, you are sure to feel helpless if you give in to your first impulse. You'll say, "There's nothing I can do about it." Gary, a marketing director, has a client who wants to change the color scheme of a brochure that's already been sent to the printer. "I'm sorry, but it's too late," Gary tells the client. "It's gone to the printer and it's out of my hands at this point." The client, desperate to make the change, calls later and talks with someone else in Gary's department. This person's reply: "Let me call the printer. As long as it hasn't actually been printed, we can still make the change." And the change is made. Now, who do you think this client wants to deal with from now on? In one interaction, Gary has lost his credibility. If he'd taken time to consider his first impulse, it would have changed the course of his relationship with the client. Number 2, the impulse to shun a challenge. When faced with a challenge that seems beyond your abilities, you're sure to feel overwhelmed if you give in to your first impulse. You'll say to yourself, "It's too difficult to even try." But if you listen to that message, you'll never discover what is often true, that you are far more capable of facing this challenge than you imagine. Consider Sandra, an account executive whose boss asked her to give a major report to the board of directors in just 3 days' time. "That's impossible," Sandra blurts out. "It will take at least a week just to pull together the information." Her boss sighs, "Do what you can," and leaves her office. Now, compare Sandra's response to Tina's when receiving the same request. Tina is just as inclined to say the same thing, but she pauses for a few seconds to let a new impulse emerge. With a new optimistic perspective, she responds, "It'll be tough, but I'll give it a shot." I don't have to tell you how her boss feels about this. And guess who is most likely to garner a coveted promotion when it becomes available? Sandra or Tina? Number 3, the impulse to settle for the status quo. When you have the opportunity to do what you dream of, what your heart longs to do, you're sure to feel unfulfilled if you give in to your first impulse. You'll say, "I'll simply do what happens to come my way." Stuart worked his way through college and graduated with an engineering degree. Not because he particularly liked engineering, it just wasn't too hard for him and it certainly pleased his parents. He worked a variety of jobs while in college, from grocery bagger to repo man. The one thing they all had in common, though, was working with customers. And sometime during the 4 years at the university, Stuart discovered that he felt passionate about customer service. It's been almost 40 years and Stuart has yet to hold a job in the engineering field. Instead, he's spent his career in retail and customer service. Some, including his parents at times, have expressed the opinion that he wasted 4 years of his life. Stuart sees things differently. He tells anyone who will listen that the decision he made during his college career to follow his passion kept him from wasting 40 years of his life. Number 4, the impulse to shirk responsibility. When you are in a thorny predicament and looking for excuses or ways to lay blame, you're sure to feel defensive if you give in to your first impulse. You'll be tempted to say, "It's not my problem." I have to wonder how many incidents of road rage can be blamed on this defensive impulse. On the roads near my home, I can witness both the impulse to act defensive and the impulse to take responsibility, often on the same outing. It's true that some drivers cut others off intentionally or recklessly, but most of us do it on accident. Imagine you're cut off in traffic. Glaring at the eyes reflected in the rearview mirror of the offending car, you see the driver glance back with surprise. Then he gives a half shrug and the universal "I'm sorry" sign, the sheepish wave. Does your anger at the driver increase or decrease? Most of us would give a little more grace to that person rather than the one who follows her first impulse and raises her hand to give some other universally known signal. Number 5, the impulse to do the mere minimum. When given an assignment at work or at home, you're sure to do the minimum required if you give in to your first impulse. In fact, most of us did that during our elementary high school years. Sure, some kids live for extra credit, but they were in the minority. It's tempting to keep following the easier first impulse throughout college and career, too. But I speak from a personal experience as a university professor when I say that the extra mile student earns not only the appropriate grade in my class, but also my respect and recommendation. Rhonda has been working in the same field for 5 years, and she can't snag a promotion. She didn't understand. She comes in on time, she completes her work, she keeps her head down and does her job. But whenever a position opens up above her, the executives always choose a colleague to promote. Or even worse, they hire someone from outside. Her boss says she just doesn't do enough to be noticed. Over the years, Rhonda's blamed sexism, racism, a good old boy network, and personality differences. But now she's starting to wonder, is there something more she could do? Number 6, the impulse to avoid taking action. Finally, when you look at plans that seem too big to tackle, you are sure to think and talk about them without actually doing anything if you give in to your first impulse. You'll say, I'm not quite ready, but I will be someday. Running a marathon had been one of Sharon's goals for 20 years. She loved to run. She'd competed at shorter distances, but she kept putting off the marathon for someday. Then her 42nd birthday arrived, and her joints started making the case for a less jolting hobby. Suddenly, someday was in doubt. All she had was now, so Sharon stopped talking about her marathon and started training for it. The October after her 43rd birthday, Sharon completed the Chicago Marathon. She would tell you it felt like it almost killed her. Her hips started aching in the 14th mile, and only sheer determination got her across the finish line. She often says she wishes she'd done the marathon while she was younger, when her body could have better handled it. But that wistful sentiment is always followed by a smile. What really matters is that I did it, no matter how hard it was. Here's my promise to you, as my reader, my listener. If you will dedicate yourself to resisting these 6 impulses, I will show you how to create a constructive alternative to each. In time, the second impulse will become almost second nature. All of the alternative impulses will take you to a higher level of living. Through them, you'll find more doors of opportunity, you'll deepen your relationships, you'll enjoy more fulfillment. It all begins with leveraging 3 seconds. Why 3 seconds makes all the difference. Every advertiser on Madison Avenue knows he has just 3 seconds to hook you with his ad. And in this short time, you not only have to see the ad, but assess the overall image, be influenced by the colors, drift to the area of main importance, what advertisers call the heat, and zero in on the central message, absorb it, identify the significance of it, and then make a decision to continue investigating it. The same holds true in the newspaper business. The editor-in-chief of every paper knows he has approximately 3 seconds per headline. And if you're still interested, approximately 3 seconds more of reading the article to decide if you want to carry on with the rest. Hence the snappy, terse, and often sensational headlines in papers and tabloids. But what happens in 3 seconds on the printed page pales in comparison to what happens in more complex social interactions. For example, in the 3 seconds it takes to walk through a door and extend your hand to someone for the first time, that person has already made irreversible judgments about you. People read intentional and unintentional signals you are putting out and react to them long before you've had a chance to say or do anything of substance. It all happens in just 3 seconds. The human mind is an astonishing contraption capable of incredibly complex procedures and analyses within milliseconds, and it does this all automatically. It doesn't have to be trained to make quick decisions and snap judgments, but it does need to learn secondary impulses if the first ones are faulty. That's what Sidney J. Harris was getting at when he said the art of living consists in knowing which impulses to obey and which must be made to obey. The 6 impulses in this book, of course, fall into the latter category. So what does it take to make these 6 unproductive impulses yield to ones worthy of our aspirations? It requires a momentary pause of 3 seconds to consider what we really want. It requires a suspension of our natural inclination to remember that we have a choice in what we will say, what we will do, and who we will be. In the study of one's personal language and self-talk, said Sidney Madwed, it can be observed that what one thinks and talks about to himself tends to become the deciding influence in his life. For what the mind attends to, the mind considers. Every successful person has honed their impulses through this method. Consciously or not, they have learned to replace helplessness with efficacy, for example, by pausing momentarily to think about and empower their second impulse. These are highly self-directed people, said Robert Cloninger, a professor of psychiatry at Washington University in St. Louis. They are resourceful in pursuing more effective alternatives. In other words, successful people don't automatically give in to initial inclinations. They don't restrict their choices. It's that 3 seconds of consideration that empowers them to choose alternatives that others never recognize. It's that 3 seconds that empowers them to disown their helplessness, embrace a challenge, fuel their passion, walk the extra mile, and all the rest. Before the race begins. A couple years ago, my friend Max Helton invited me to join him at the world-famous Indianapolis 500 auto race. It was something I'd always wanted to do, and I was thrilled by the invitation. After all, it is the largest single-day sporting event in the world, in both on-grounds attendance and international audience. Les, he told me, you're going to get an up-close and personal look at the world of Formula One racing. And he wasn't kidding. Not only did he arrange for me to meet many of the race teams and drivers on Gasoline Alley, that garage area where the racing cars are housed, but he secured a coveted pass allowing me to be in the pit lane on the start-finish straight. I'd never experienced anything like it. Even with earplugs, the roar of the powerful engines is thunderous, and the blur of the 33 open-wheeled cars as they make their laps is exhilarating. But the most amazing sight for me was the pit stop. Of course, this is where time is critical. As a car coasts in, a team of up to 20 mechanics swarms in to work on that single car, refueling, replacing tires, making repairs and mechanical adjustments, and changing drivers if necessary. It is a true flurry of activity that lasts mere seconds. After the race, I asked one of the members of the crew how he could make so many crucial decisions so quickly. His reply made a lot of sense. He said, we make all our decisions long before the race begins. He explained that they think through every imaginable scenario that could happen during a race, and they run drills to practice exactly what they would do in each situation. By the time we are in the pit on race day, it becomes second nature, he said. Based on what I witnessed, it truly was. Each crew worked with assurance, confident that they were doing the best things for their team. Likewise, the key to mastering the 3-second principle is making the decision in advance and practicing until it becomes second nature. In this book, you'll learn to make some important life decisions before the race begins. It doesn't matter which race you're currently running, education, career, early marriage, parenting, empty nest, or retirement, you can learn to pause for 3 seconds now and begin to assess your decisions. You can start today to turn the positive second impulses into second nature. 3 seconds make up a very small percentage of the 86,400 seconds in a day, but they're all you need to move from who you are to who you want to be, to go from whatever to whatever it takes.
Chapter 1. It takes 3 seconds to empower yourself. Confidence is going after Moby Dick in a rowboat and taking the tartar sauce with you. Zig Ziglar.
Bye-bye. Bye now. Thank you for flying with us. I gave a smile and a half wave to the friendly flight attendant as I disembarked from a plane into Chicago's O'Hare Airport. I was on my way from my home city of Seattle to a speaking engagement in Minneapolis. Eager to catch my connecting flight, I dragged my 2-wheeled suitcase along with my well-worn briefcase straight to the reader board in the terminal. There it was, gate B-19. It was just a few paces from where I was standing, so I strolled over, but behind the counter at B-19, the electronic sign indicated that the flight was headed to Denver, not Minneapolis. "Excuse me," I asked the gate attendant, "is this plane going to Denver?" "No." He didn't even look up. "The sign is stuck, and there's nothing I can do about it." "So is it going to Minneapolis?" "Yes. I just made an announcement about it," he said. "Well, I didn't hear your announcement because I just arrived, so he interrupted me and said, "It's going to Minneapolis. You can take a seat." And with that, I scanned the waiting area for a place to sit. I found a chair next to the counter and next to an elderly woman. She smiled knowingly, as if to say, I know, he's a grump. He's been snapping at people for the last 20 minutes about that sign, she said. You'd think he'd do something about it. At that moment, another passenger arrived at the gate and asked the grumpy agent the same predictable question. Again, he snapped the same response, and the passenger sheepishly walked away. After a few more identical exchanges with new customers, his fellow gate agent arrived behind the counter. She looked at the sign and frowned, then looked up at the paper in her hand and back at the sign. I was close enough to hear their conversation. I know, said the grumpy agent. The sign is stuck and I can't get the office to change it. I've tried everything. Well, she said after a momentary pause, let's change it ourselves. She used a black marker to write Minneapolis on a standard sheet of paper and taped it over the incorrect electronic sign. There, she said, it may not look very pretty, but that should make it go more smoothly. And it did. The impulse to empower yourself almost always does. Why? Because it's the catalyst a person needs to take action and to improve a situation. It doesn't matter whether you're an airline employee, a school teacher, or a real estate agent. You could be a military captain, restaurant manager, sales representative, or a member of Congress or the clergy. In every case, the journey from powerlessness to empowerment is essential to moving from whatever to whatever it takes. So why the difference between the two gate agents? Why are some folks passive when confronted with problems, acting about as helpless as a beetle on its back? And why are others able to reject this approach and take action? I've given a lot of thought to these questions, and I think I've found the answer in a mountain of research. Why some people are passive. At a recent conference for technology leaders and artists in Monterey, California, I sat next to one of the most respected psychologists on the planet, Martin Seligman of the University of Pennsylvania. He's championed a movement that is changing the global face of psychological research. It's called positive psychology, and his groundbreaking work has shed a tremendous amount of light on how we can live more fully. It all started 30 years ago when Seligman stumbled onto the life-altering attitude of helplessness. As a 21-year-old graduate student, fresh out of college, he observed an experiment that set him on a quest to understand why some people give up and remain passive while others look for positive solutions and overcome and achieve. For the experiment, researchers taught dogs to associate a tone with a very mild shock. The dogs were restricted in a harness and repeatedly exposed to the sound followed by the shock. The hypothesis was that later, upon hearing the same tone, the conditioned dogs would associate it with an oncoming shock and run or otherwise try to escape. Seligman and his associates placed an unrestrained dog inside a shuttle box, a container divided in half by a low wall. When the tone sounded, the dog could easily escape the discomfort of the mild shock by jumping over the wall onto the other half of the box. But the researchers were surprised by the dog's response. On hearing the tone, instead of jumping away to the other side of the box, the dog lay down and began to whine. Even when the shock came, it did nothing to evade it. They tried the same thing with all the previously conditioned dogs. A full 2/3 of them didn't even try to escape the negative stimulus. Seligman concluded that these dogs had learned to be helpless. In the early conditioning, they had received a shock no matter how much they barked or jumped or struggled. They'd learned that nothing they did mattered, so why try? Have you ever felt like one of these dogs? Have you ever given up because it seemed as though you were helpless? If so, you're not alone. Like the dogs in Seligman's experiment, people who respond in a helpless manner have learned this response. At some point in their attempts to achieve goals and succeed in life, they've been thwarted. When this happens enough and they believe that their efforts make no difference, they give up. Soon they even quit trying. They automatically say, "There's nothing I can do about it." This learned helplessness dismantles their confidence and puts them on the powerless path. You're not as helpless as you think. For a powerless person, a lucky break seems to be the only way to achieve success. In other words, they've come to believe that only their circumstances, not what they do with those circumstances, can create something good. In reality, nobody is as helpless as they think. Even in Seligman's experiment, while 2/3 of the dogs gave up, 1/3 of their number, conditioned in the same way, sought and found a way to avoid the shock. They chose to keep trying. Likewise, we only give in to helplessness because we've decided to. We trade an optimistic can-do attitude for a passive approach that we think lets us off the hook. Or even worse, we come to believe that if we don't try, we can't fail. Seligman wrote his first paper on this phenomenon of learned helplessness shortly after earning his PhD in 1967, and he has spent the rest of his life exploring it. He says it still amazes him that some people react just like the majority of the dogs when exposed to discomfort or pain. Some people act as if they are helpless and don't even try to change things. Others are energized to find a solution. The difference between them? Merely a 3-second choice. Your finest hour or not? One of the all-time greatest examples of these two attitudes occurred in April of 1970, in the midst of America's era of space exploration. The Apollo 13 spacecraft, on its way to a lunar landing, was seriously damaged by an in-flight explosion. The moon landing was scrapped. Suddenly, every resource was devoted to getting the 3 astronauts home. You may have viewed the drama of this episode in Ron Howard's movie Apollo 13, starring Tom Hanks. If so, you probably remember the palpable tension both inside the spacecraft and at Mission Control in Houston, Texas. 3 astronauts and a room full of technicians at Mission Control faced what appeared to be an impossible situation. Low on power and oxygen, the astronauts were working against time. Technicians brainstormed ideas and listed items already on the ship to help the astronauts navigate and make repairs. With the service module disabled, they needed to navigate into position to land on Earth with the lunar landing module. Any miscalculation could send the ship spiraling thousands of miles off course into outer space. Then, even if they succeeded in getting into position and crowding into the command module for re-entry, they had no way of knowing if its heat shield and parachutes would be functional. Finally, if re-entry was successful, weather reports indicated that they would be splashing down in the midst of a hurricane. During this crisis, every single decision was a calculated risk. Catastrophe seemed imminent. One scene in the 1995 movie crystallizes the situation. A press agent for NASA, seeking more information from the NASA director, began to recount the multitude of dangers facing the crew. Clearly stressed, the official responded, "I know what's the problem here, Henry. It would be the worst disaster NASA's ever experienced." Gene Kranz, the flight director, overhearing this pessimistic assessment, responded sharply, "With all due respect, sir, I believe this is going to be our finest hour." Think about that. 2 men facing the same situation, one man preparing for the worst, the other expecting the pinnacle of success. The situation was so tense and portrayed so effectively in the movie that even though viewers knew the outcome, we all sat on the edge of our seats. Beating almost insurmountable odds, the astronauts and technicians managed to get the module into position for re-entry. As the command module entered Earth's atmosphere, radio contact was lost. In homes across the nation, all eyes were fixed on television screens. At Mission Control, seconds ticked by. As they approached the 3-minute mark, the radio operator began trying to reestablish contact. "Odyssey, this is Houston. Do you read me?" On televisions across America, the blank sky appeared. Walter Cronkite's voice informed the viewing audience that no space capsule had ever taken longer than 3 minutes to complete re-entry. The silence that followed was agonizing. Suddenly, the radio at NASA crackled to life. On TV, a capsule materialized seemingly out of thin air, and the parachutes appeared like giant flowers bursting into bloom, and a voice rang out loud and clear, "Hello, Houston. This is Odyssey. It's good to see you again." What's your approach? Put yourself in the shoes of an official at the NASA team struggling to solve an overwhelming problem and divert a huge crisis. With only seconds to make decisions, you don't have the luxury of time to mull over things. What are you thinking? Do you identify with the official who sees only imminent disaster? Or are you more like the flight director? Do you see a problem as an opportunity to reveal your finest hour? Of course, sitting and listening to this book, it's easy to say that we'd identify with the determined flight director. We all want to believe that we'd approach a problem with confidence and optimism. But would you really? Let's be honest, this kind of valor is rare, very rare. Truth be told, most of us lack such boldness. Instead, we prepare to justify a passive approach that will later explain away our failure, even when the stakes aren't nearly as high as the National Space Expedition. There was nothing I could do, we say to ourselves and anyone who will listen. Whether it's failing to avert a disaster, close a sale, win a contract, quiet a crying toddler, or initiate a potential relationship, our first impulse is often powerlessness. And no matter how irrational our helplessness is, it convinces us we've done everything we possibly can. Helplessness empowers only passivity. That's why the question of who you really identify with in the NASA scenario is so important. How you answer says a lot about your confidence level and where you land on the helplessness continuum. And that, in turn, reveals much about your ability to achieve success. Why? Because the person who is committed to doing whatever it takes to achieving success in both big and small goals rejects the first impulse of powerlessness and chooses to believe that he has the power to make a difference. Exercising your mental muscle. So why did the NASA flight director react with such optimism? Why didn't he succumb to helplessness in the face of such a daunting task? To help us answer this question, consider athletes, specifically Olympic-caliber athletes. What separates the great hopefuls from the great achievers? Every Olympic athlete can tell you the difference. It's the application of mental muscle. A computer with all the power in the world is useless without software to make it run, and so is it with the Olympian whose mind is the software controlling that collection of hardware known as flesh and bone and muscle. Aside from their astonishing physical prowess, it is the Olympians' mental muscles and how they flex them that really sets them apart from everyday athletes. And that mental muscle is known by professionals as high self-efficacy. It's the very opposite of helplessness. The dictionary defines self-efficacy as the power to produce desired results. It reflects an optimistic self-belief that one can perform novel or difficult tasks or cope with adversity in life. Perceived self-efficacy empowers goal setting. It determines how much effort you'll invest in any given task. It prescribes your persistence when facing barriers. It reveals how well you'll recover from your setbacks. It's difficult to exaggerate the value of self-efficacy in generating a whatever-it-takes attitude. Why? Because this mental muscle compels you to see that your actions, not your circumstances, are responsible for successful outcomes. How many times have you heard someone say, "Well, there's nothing I can do," or "It's not my job, so it's not my problem," or "What do you expect me to do about it?" These are the sayings of a helpless mind. To turn this mind around, it only takes a modicum of efficacy and as little as 3 seconds. How to empower yourself. Let's get practical. If rejecting helplessness is a goal you have, you'll be best served by cultivating its opposite, self-efficacy. The following 3 actions will help you do just that. They aren't presented in any order. They are simply the 3 actions that have proven most successful in this area. Practice each of them as often as you can. Number 1, say what you know instead of what you don't. Historian Stephen Ambrose wrote a fascinating book, later made by Tom Hanks into a miniseries on HBO called Band of Brothers. It documents the journey of a company of U.S. paratroopers through their grueling training, the D-Day invasion, and the intense fighting on the ground leading up to the end of World War II. Based on real-life interviews with the veterans of Easy Company, the series captures both the intensity of war and the heroism of the troops. In one scene of the movie, immediately after the paratroopers hit the ground in France, Lieutenant Winters, the commanding officer of Easy Company, and Private Hall, a scared young man from another company, wandered through the countryside in search of the rest of the Americans. In the confusion of anti-aircraft fire, the troopers were dropped far outside the planned jump zone. The private radiates fear and insecurity because he lacks the exact knowledge of where he is. "Do you have any idea where we are, sir?" he asks. "Some," Lieutenant Winters replies. "I need your help to locate some landmarks to get our bearings. Keep your eyes peeled for buildings, farmhouses, bridges, and roads." "I wonder if the rest of them are as lost as we are." "We're not lost, Private. We're in Normandy." I love that line. It's so revealing. The lieutenant is focusing on what he knows. He sees the big picture, and unlike the private, he's confident of a positive outcome. Through Lieutenant Winter's leadership, the men soon find their companies and make it to the rendezvous point with the rest of the Americans. That's efficacy, the power to produce desired results. Lieutenant Winters had strong mental muscle. He rejected his first impulse and chose to wait for the second. That impulse, empowerment, helped him to focus on what he did know. He said things that reflected his desired results. An empowered person says things like, "I've got a pretty good hunch here," or "I'm sure I can find the answer," or "I don't have a solution yet, but I will soon." Recently, a friend of mine was on an urgent deadline trying to prepare for an important presentation. While he was in the middle of typing a sentence, his screen suddenly went blank. Have you been there? Feeling panicky, more than a little sick to his stomach, he called his company's IT department. After much begging and pleading, he convinced them to send a technician right away. The technician, let's call him Bob, sat down at the desk as my friend hovered anxiously behind him. He rebooted, asked my friend about recent activity. He typed away in DOS. Finally, my friend could stand it no longer. "What do you think is wrong? Can you fix and retrieve my stuff?" "No idea. I've never seen this before, and I don't even know where to start," Bob replied. "But I've got to go to lunch. I'll send Steve over after 1 o'clock. As you can imagine, my friend did not go to lunch on the chance that Steve would come by when he was gone. He started rehearsing what he'd say to his boss if this didn't get fixed and he missed the deadline. "What can I do to help you?" Startled out of his reverie, my friend jumped up and held out the chair for the person he hoped would save the day. "Bob's filled me in on what he tried," Steve said, and started typing. Nothing new happened. The program still wouldn't open. My friend asked if Steve knew how to fix it. "I know something is causing the processor to freeze up, but I can't tell what it is yet. But give me a few minutes. I'll figure it out." Which guy would you want working on your computer? My friend certainly felt a lot more confident with the guy who had his bearings and said so. At least Steve had a sense of direction, even if he hadn't pinpointed the exact problem. Steve did eventually fix my friend's computer. As he left, he said he was sure that Bob would have figured it out too. At any rate, my friend was glad that Bob got hungry. We all face uncertain situations. In what areas are you least confident in a positive outcome? Do you tend to focus on what you don't know? By saying what you do know, you'll defeat powerlessness and free your mind to search for solutions. Number 2, cultivate care and really mean it. Over 400 executives of the nation's largest companies in a variety of fields answered a survey by Opinion Research Corporation on how they chose an airline for their frequent travelers. The executives rated a number of factors, and more than prompt baggage delivery or efficient check-in, the aspect that mattered most to the vast majority was how much an airline cares about its customers. We all know how much we as customers value caring service. I'm talking about personal service, the kind that is delivered by a real live person, either behind the sales counter or at the other end of the telephone. Caring is the difference between a shrug of the shoulders with "there's nothing I can do" and a confident nod with "let's see what we can do for you." In another survey by William Wilstead, an advisor to Ernst & Young, the accounting and consulting firm, customers in banking, high-tech, and manufacturing considered the personal touch, the company's commitment, and whether he or she remembers a customer's name to be the most important element of service. It beat out all other factors, even convenience, speed of delivery, and how well the product worked. It's funny how we toss this vital force around so carelessly. "Take care," we say to the grocery clerk who rings up our items. "Take care," we say at the end of a phone conversation with an acquaintance. But did you know that the word care comes from the German "Kar," which originally meant sad? The implication is that a caring person feels sad when another feels sad. In other words, care is a kind of compassion that allows all of us, mechanics, real estate agents, teachers, grocers, parents, to enter the world of another and feel what they feel. Care says that whatever happens to you happens to me. The moment you care about another person's predicament, whether it's lost luggage when you work for an airline or a child sniffles if you're a school teacher, is when you engage and transfer self-efficacy. Why? Because the old adage is true. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Your compassion and confidence inspire and comfort others, making it easier for them to believe in a positive outcome. In my role as a college professor, I see this principle at work every day. My students won't give a rip about my academic degree until they know that I genuinely care about what they learn from me. And when I can convince them of how deeply invested I am in their future, I can almost do no wrong in their eyes. Number 3, brandish optimism like a weapon. This may sound a bit extreme, but optimism can be a matter of life and death. A recent study of 1,000 people aged 65 to 85 demonstrates this. At the end of the 10-year survey period, researchers found that people who describe themselves as optimistic had a 55% lower risk of death from all causes and a 23% lower risk of heart-related death. One of the most telling examples of the power of optimism comes from another study conducted by Martin Seligman on insurance salesmen with MetLife. Everyone in sales knows that being able to take rejection with grace is essential. This is especially true with a product like insurance, where the ratio of no's to yeses can be discouragingly high. In fact, the rejection in that field is so bad that about 3/4 of insurance salespeople quit within their first 3 years. Through his study, Seligman found that new salesmen, who were by nature optimists, sold 37% more insurance in their first 2 years on the job than did their pessimistic colleagues. And the optimists stayed on the job longer than the pessimists. Impressed with these findings, MetLife allowed Seligman to conduct a follow-up study. This time, they hired only applicants who had both failed the normal screening test and scored high on a test of optimism. Could optimism trump all other qualities deemed necessary to be successful? Apparently so. This group outsold the pessimists by 21% in their first year and 57% in the second. Now, you know that optimism will benefit you, but how do you increase it in yourself? For the successful salesman, the answer lay in the way they explain failure to themselves. For a salesperson, every no received is a small defeat, and as the no's mount up, morale can deteriorate, making that much tougher to keep trying. But such rejection is doubly difficult for a pessimist because they explain the no to themselves by saying, "I'm no good at this. I'll never make a sale," an explanation that is sure to trigger helplessness. Optimists, on the other hand, tell themselves, "I'm using the wrong approach," or "that last person was just in a bad mood." They don't take the rejection personally, so they believe the next sales call will go better. Optimism is like a sharp sword cutting through barriers to empowerment. It takes 3 seconds to empower yourself. I open this chapter with a real-life story of my recent layover in Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Remember the resourceful gate agent for the flight to Minneapolis? As I mentioned, she's a great example of someone who knows how to empower herself. By creating a hand-lettered sign to correct the broken electronic one, she said what she knew instead of what she didn't. She showed that she cared about making things run smoothly for her customers, and she was optimistic that her solution would correct the problem. But what I didn't tell you was that when she took this simple initiative to improve the situation, the passengers in the waiting area actually applauded her effort. A cheer went up all around from a collection of strangers to say thank you to a woman they'd never met. People in other parts of the terminal stared in our direction to see why we were applauding. But what I noticed most in that moment was her helpless colleague. He could have cheered her on too. He could have said, "I wish I'd thought of that." But instead, he simply shrugged his shoulders, rolled his eyes as if to say, "Whatever." And there it was, in living color, the dividing line between those who give it their all and those who don't give it a second thought. It's merely a decision made in just 3 seconds' time to empower oneself and to do whatever it takes.
You're listening to 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott. This concludes this disc. Please proceed to Disc 2 for the continuation of the program.